Hi, today we're going to create services that communicate with each other using RSocket. So there will be a server app and a client app. So let's start. So we'll start with creating our server app. So on start.spring.io, we already specified the language, the project, and the different metadata. And on the dependency, we're going to add RSocket and then just the Lombok. Okay. Download the server app. So while doing that, let's also create our client app. So on the client app, we're also going to use the RSocket dependency and the Lombok. Okay, so we need these two applications to show communication using RSocket. So I'm just extracting it, and then I'm going to put it to some directory which will be easy for me to find when I open the project. Okay, so I'm going to open the project. We'll start with the server application. Okay, so just wait for. Okay, so let's create now. Name the package controller, and then here I just name it say RSocket controller. So in order for us to create a server-side RSocket application, we need to annotate the class as a controller. Then in our example, we're going to dive into the two features of RSocket, that is the fire and forget and the request response. Okay. So let's create two mapping that we are going to use for the server side. The server side RSocket controller class will allow us to accept requests from the client. So we need to annotate this class as of type controller, and in order this class to accept requests, we need to use RSocket annotation, which is message mapping. Okay, and then we need to specify the name of this method. So let's name this as fire and forget. So fire and forget method. So let's create a method that accepts a string, in this case say name, and then let's just log it. Okay, so let's use the Lombok SLF4J, then log info receive, and then the name, this one. Okay, now the other method is the request response. So since this is a request response, it requires a return type. So let's return a string. So this also accept a string parameter. So log info receive, say name, and then we say and returning say greet equals to welcome, then returning greet plus space and then plus name. So it will return welcome and the name. Okay, so return greet plus space plus name. All right. So we already configured our application for fire and forget, and then the request response. Now we need to specify for this service to run. We need to specify the port for the RSocket. So on application properties, write Spring RSocket server port and then the port itself. So let's just use 7000 and just add this one, lazy initialization, also true. Okay, so let's run this server up. All right, our server app is now running. So we can now write our code for the client where it will try to communicate to the server application and invoke this method. The first one is fire and forget, so mean the client calls this method but returns nothing. The second method, which is the request response, will allow our client to call this method but will wait and accept a response. Okay, so let's open the client application. Okay, so let's set our port for this service, say 8005. Let's create the RSocket config. Let's name it RSocket client. And this is a configuration. Also, we'll use SLF4G for logging. Private final RSocket requester, and then let's create the constructor, which has a parameter of a builder. So builder dot RSocket connector. Let's specify the retry functionality, fixed delay, 3 retries with a duration of say every 1 second. Then the strategies, configure dot encoder. Let's specify the encoder. So Jackson Cibor encoder, and then the decoder new. So Cibor is a encoding which uses binary format. Okay, the MIME type, media type, that application Cibor. Then where are we going to connect? So local host, which is 7000. This is our server port on the server application. Okay, so this one, so this. Okay, assign this one. Okay, so let's expose this property so that later we'll be able to use it on the other class. Okay. Now let's create a controller here. Say client controller. Oh, sorry, package. Let's go directly to class client controller. Okay, so this is a REST controller. So public void fire and forget. So we're going to call the get mapping, the fire and forget method of the server. Fire and forget. Okay, so we need to auto wire the RSocket client. Okay, then here the client get request store, then the route, which is in this case we specify here on the server side to be fire and forget. So this is our route. Then data. So we're going to pass the data, which is this type of data, which is a string. So it's just a name, a string name. So let's say John. Then send, then block. Block means we are going to subscribe to this RSocket. Okay, so what will happen here is when we call this endpoint, which is in this case localhost 8005/fire and forget, it will try to request the server side route, which is fire and forget, which is this one. Okay, and then we'll be able to see the log here. Our client app is now running. So we'll call this endpoint fire and forget, and then call the server side with the route fire and forget, and then send the data of type string, which in this case is just a name, which is John. Then on the server side, this method will be called, and then we'll just monitor the console log of the server app, which says receive and then the value that we send to the server. So since the client app is on 8005 and then the endpoint is fire and forget, we can use curl Let's open the server app console, and then we'll say curl http localhost 8005 and then fire and forget. Okay, so if you notice on the curl, we didn't see any response since our method returns void. Okay, but on the server side, our request was received, and then if you notice on the console, this slug was executed. Okay, so the fire and forget method is working. Then let's look at the request response. So on the client side, I've already created the method in advance, which is request response. And then this also get the requester. And then the route we use here is request response, which is on the server side, this one. And then we only have a simple implementation where we receive the name, log whatever value we receive, and then returning the greet, which is welcome plus the name itself. So the method returns a string, which is greet space and the name. And then on the client side, we return it to the caller, which is in this case the curl itself. So we are expecting that when we call this request response method, we're going to receive a string. So let's test. Request response. All right, so we received the method, the response, which is welcome John, which we generate from the server app itself. Okay, so this is an introduction to the RSocket implementation for Spring Boot. Happy coding!